It's hard to know what to believe. Either the Social Security system is in a crisis and needs to be fixed immediately, or it isn't. Either personal savings accounts are an essential part of saving Social Security, or they aren't. Either the budget deficits we're building up are going to trigger an international financial meltdown, or they won't. I'm Sarah Bartlett, and these are the messy topics we're going to try to sort out today on USA Inc. Joining me today is Pete Peterson, the senior chairman and co-founder of the Blackstone Group, one of Wall Street's most successful investment banks. Mr. Peterson is a former Secretary of Commerce in the Nixon administration and the author of Running on Empty, a compelling account of how we got into this financial mess. Pete, thanks for being with us today.
My great pleasure.
My first question is about the dimensions of this problem. The Bush administration has made a big point that this is a real crisis in Social Security in particular, and yet the Democrats are saying, what crisis? They're really, it's overblown. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I don't want to get involved in antics with semantics as to whether it's a crisis. It's certainly a problem. Let me try to describe it. I think it's time we tell the American people that Social Security is a pay-as-you-go cash flow system. The money comes in a year and it goes right out. In about 12 or 13 years, 2018, it goes from a cash flow surplus, which has been reducing our budget deficit, because unlike what we promised many years ago, we're spending the money. And to show you how much it's reducing it, over the next 10 years, our budget deficits would be $1 trillion higher than they would be if we weren't using the Social Security surpluses. But now that big positive in about 12 or 13 years goes negative. How negative? It goes negative very fast. By 2030, it's expected it would be $250 billion a year deficit, not a surplus, in current dollars. And then it heads off into the trillions. Another way of looking at how serious the Social Security problem is, and I'll get to Medicare in a moment, because that's the big elephant in the boudoir that we pretend isn't there, and we hope nobody is rude enough to mention it to us. Another way of measuring this is what is called unfunded liabilities. And the Bush administration points out that the unfunded liabilities, which means liabilities you have that you haven't set aside, on their method of calculation, about 11 or 12 trillion dollars. That's an awful lot of money. It ain't nearly as much as Medicare, which is $62 trillion. Another way of measuring the severity of the Social Security problem is if you said, how much over the next 30, 40 years is the cost going to go up? It's about 7% of pay. Now that, unfortunately, falls on the middle class very largely, not on people like me. And it's the very class that we keep saying needs a tax cut. And that doesn't include Medicare. Now the Medicare tax increase would be much higher. And if you put the two together to cover the costs, it's over a third of pay from where it is today, which would be, I think, politically and economically and morally unthinkable.
Are you saying that we would have to spend 1/3 of our pay to
on
satisfy
payroll
the debts?
taxes would have to be about 1/3 of pay
for both Social
to cover
Security
both Social Security and Medicare.
And Medicare.
So you can call that anything you want. Another way of looking at it, and I tend to think of these two programs together, because when you stop and think about it, they're out of the same payroll tax, and they go essentially to the same people, the elderly. I've been involved with the Concord Coalition, which have been very much interested in fiscal responsibility. I asked them to calculate when these entitlement programs plus interest would consume the entire budget. And that's in about 2020. So this is not a fair. Now, we do the American people an enormous disservice by talking about this trust fund. I've collected oxymorons ever since I was in the Nixon administration, because one day I picked up the Time magazine and I burst out laughing because they referred to me as the most powerful Secretary of Commerce since Herbert Hoover. Now, I burst out laughing for two reasons. First, we all know what happened to Herbert Hoover, so I don't know whether that was a compliment or not. But anybody that's had that job knows there's never been a powerful Secretary of Commerce. So I've collected oxymorons for 30 years now. My favorite is the House Ethics Committee. But if you've got a lot of time, I've got about 50 of them I have concocted. The trust fund.
Have to do a separate show on that.
Separate show on Peterson's oxymorons. The trust fund belongs in the first tier because it shouldn't be trusted and it's not funded. And whether you have a trust fund or not has no practical effect. You still have to do the same three things. You have to either cut the benefits, you have to increase taxes, as I've indicated, or you try to borrow. Now, how much would you have to borrow? We endlessly tell the American people that Social Security is, quote, solvent because of the trust fund until 2042. If you think of it the way I think you should think of it, which is on a cash flow basis, between 2018 and 2042, this magic solvency date, we would have to borrow $5.4 trillion in current dollars. Now, if that's your definition of solvency, be my guest. So is it a crisis? It depends on the dimensions you're talking about. In about 12 or 13 years, it begins to be a very serious problem.
Well, it sounds like it already is.
Yeah.
Now, enormous amounts of time have been spent on personal savings accounts, which the Bush administration has initially suggested would solve or go a long way to solving our problems. What do you make of that?
Well, I would object to the phrase savings accounts because it isn't savings. Let's be sure we understand. I wish it were, and I'll mention in a moment, I think I happen to believe in retirement accounts, but only if they're funded with new savings. What the administration is proposing, essentially, is that we borrow the money to fund these accounts.
How
Now,
so? What's the mechanism there?
well, that we take the money out of the payroll tax, but you'd have to borrow that money to pay, you know, the benefits. And you're talking about a tremendous amount of money. The administration talks about the next few years about $750 billion. But the Concord Coalition staff tells me it would go on for 3 decades, a few trillion a decade. Now, I find that a very unattractive idea because I think one of the most serious crises facing the American economy is the dollar crisis caused by the unprecedented current account or foreign deficit, where we're borrowing $2.5 billion every workday from foreigners. Now,
to pay for our deficits.
To pay for your current account deficits. Now, the thought that we would announce to the world that we're going to borrow another $7, $8, $9 trillion is not a signal I think it's prudent to send. So I like private retirement accounts. I love your phrase, savings accounts. But my theory is if this country desperately needs savings so we aren't so dependent on the rest of the world, I think I'm in favor of an add-on program in which I would have 2 to 3% of pay that would go into a real savings account. It would be invested in fixed income and equity index funds, because the thought of a bunch of brokers on Wall Street handling 1,000, 2,000, you spent your life there, the administrative costs would greatly reduce. And also, you would protect yourself against investor imprudence, and from the government telling us what industries are politically correct or incorrect. But that would be your own money. And then I'd probably have a subsidy for the poor to make it easier for them to participate. Now, the effect of that it would increase national savings, which we desperately need. But people would really then have a retirement account that was real, because the money would be taken out of the government's hands, and every quarter or so you'd get a statement that you have.
Would this be voluntary?
No. Now that's an interesting question. For a Republican, maybe it sounds contrarian. But let me tell you why I have decided it has to be mandatory. A number of years ago, I chaired a committee for the White House and the Congress on capital formation, which is a fancy word for savings. And I got the best economists I could, left, right, and center. And I said, let's start with your evaluation of all our tax savings incentives, 401ks and so forth. Somewhat to my surprise, they were unanimous that the effect of those savings incentives are very limited and very ambiguous. Why is that? Because a lot of the money that goes into 401ks would have been saved anyway, and people take advantage of the tax incentive, which costs the government money, which reduces the net number. So I said, what are you characters telling me? You tell me on the one hand we need savings, but on the other hand these incentives don't work. They said, Pete, we have become such a consumption-obsessed society. And if I could suggest another show for you, I'm the television producer and me, somebody ought to do a show on what happened to America. We used to be the biggest savers in the world, and we're now the lowest savers. We've become absolutely consumption-obsessed. But they said in this country, at this time, if you want to increase savings, you're going to have to do what Singapore did, what Chile did, what Australia did, which is to make it mandatory.
Do you think that the middle-class family could afford to set aside additional money? I mean, the reason they don't now, presumably, is that they don't feel they have that option.
Well, the reason they don't now is a very interesting question of how we got there. We seem to have created a kind of, I want it all, and I want it now kind of mentality. And 9/11 may well have created a further feeling that I don't know how long I'm going to be around or what the problem is, but hell, I'm going to spend it.
Go for broke.
But our consumption growth has just been staggering. And we're totally comfortable with borrowing a lot of money. And now household debt as a percentage of the GDP is very high. We're buying houses. 45% of the new mortgages are floating rate debt. Well, long-term interest rates are now at record lows. And you would have thought of a rational analysis would have been, why don't we take advantage of these long rates?
Lock in a...
Lock it in. Mm-hmm. But instead, people are so preoccupied with the short term and so forth that to save 1% now, they're willing to take the risk that several years from now, interest rates could be up at 7-8% where they normally are on 10-year rates.
And they'll feel that.
So there's something about the American psyche of consumption and pleasure and avoiding sacrifice that I think has become pretty part of our basic culture in America.
We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Pete Peterson, Senior Chairman and co-founder of the Blackstone Group. What kinds of things do you think should be done to address the solvency issues of Social Security and the other entitlement programs?
Right. Well, there are really only two approaches: cut benefits or raise the payroll taxes. Some people say to me, well, why don't we just get rid of this Bush tax cuts? Actually, they're winking as they say that because they never want to get rid of all of them. It's just get rid of them for people like me. If you got rid of all the Bush tax cuts, you only cover about 1/9 of the increased costs of Social Security and Medicare. So the melancholy fact we're going to have to deal with here is while payroll tax increases may eventually be part of the solution, benefit reductions are going to have to cover the big part of it.
Can't be avoided.
How do we make them benign and gradual and so forth? I think we have to protect the safety net. This great rich country cannot be in a position where the destitute and the poor are thrown out on the streets. There have been several approaches recommended, increasing the retirement age, and I would index it to longevity, because if you think these problems are depressing, imagine we live 10 years longer. I call something an affluence test, which sounds nicer than a means test, but fat cats like me would get their benefits reduced. In proposing those, what I used to find is a whole bunch of political objections for whatever the reasons are, and it aggregates negatives. So I got very intrigued in some discussions with Lady Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain, on what she did. The American public is uninformed, broadly, with the fact that while they know that Social Security benefits go up with inflation, the COLA, most people are aware of that. They're not aware of the fact that in 1979 they also indexed them to wage increases. And that makes it almost impossible to grow out of the problem, because as wages go up, so do the costs. She eliminated wage indexing. And as a result, Great Britain is in much better shape on Social Security than any other country. If you eliminated wage indexing, you would get rid of all of the $11–12 trillion of unfunded liabilities. You would have a safety net. The kids and the parents would get the same benefits. There are no free lunches here. What would happen is that the percent of our kids' wages that they got would go down compared to the current promises, but we aren't able to keep the current promises anyway, and anything that you do to reduce the benefits in the future is going to change that ratio. So I've decided that may be the best approach to reducing the benefits.
How serious an impact would it have on benefits? I mean, would it actually remove that safety net that you feel is
No, because everyone would still get the current benefits plus inflation every year. So they would get the same benefit in real dollars.
So it's less than they would have otherwise had, but it's still
a smaller percentage
safe
of their pre-retirement wages. But of course, if we raise taxes on our kids dramatically, then they're going to get less net anyway. So we have to face the melancholy fact that we can't pay for all these promises that we have.
That sounds like a very reasonable solution. What are the chances that it'll actually go anywhere?
Well, I don't know. I just don't know.
How do you see the politics?
We're in a society of all gain and no pain, and all get and no give. And I'm a son of Greek immigrants, and I'm a great admirer of the American dream and what my parents did and what Tom Brokaw's greatest generation did. I mean, my parents' generation, if they wanted to do something, they paid for it, you know. I mean, if they wanted to have a GI Bill or highways or the Marshall Plan or whatever, they paid for it. Now, we can talk glibly about we're going to add this benefit and we're going to give you this and give you that, but the question of who pays for it is left unanswered. And the blunt answer to that question is our kids are going to pay for it. So I think this whole discussion, and I wish a leader would put it in these terms, is a moral discussion at bottom. There was a great philosopher named Bonhoeffer, theologian actually, a German, who said the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that we leave to our kids and grandkids. Now, what are we leaving these kids? One is a doubling of their payroll taxes, or these horrific debts and interest costs that would go with it, where we're endangering their future. And the parents and grandparents, it isn't that they don't love their kids, of course they do, but they've been so misled by political amnesia, you know, and
I would have expected the Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, to sort of jump in here and really sound the alarm. I don't really see that.
Well, I was encouraged by what I read in the paper today. He's getting much tougher on this issue. And I suspect one thing that worries our venerable chairman is this foreign deficit and how serious it might be if we send the wrong signals and foreigners lose confidence. Because if foreigners lose confidence, then we take the risk that Paul Volcker has said he thinks there's a 75% chance of in 5 years, of the so-called hard landing, where the dollar falls suddenly and interest rates go way up and it raises havoc with mortgage rates and financial markets and so forth. So I want to be sure that in quote Social Security quote unquote reform, we don't end up with what the doctors call iatrogenic treatments. Iatrogenic from the Greek, iatro is the doctor. There are treatments that have their own problem diseases where the cure is worse than the disease. Well, if we quote reform Social Security, but in the course of doing it, we do nothing about the solvency issue, and we go out and try to borrow trillions, we may end up with a serious iatrogenic disease here.
Well, you're a member of the Wall Street community, and I read that the Bush administration says, oh, the Wall Street community totally understands that this would simply be a wash, there'd be no problem here. Why is that not so?
I don't know which part of the Wall Street community. They aren't talking to me. I interviewed 12 people as part of my book, Running on Empty, who know a lot more about these things than I do. Even before this Social Security business came up, about half of them think the risks were high of the hard landing, and the other half think they're high of the softer landing, which is still a landing. It's no takeoff. I mean, interest rates still go up, the dollar, but it happens more gradually. And I think the effect on the dollar is really a critical issue we're going to have to face here.
Why have we not seen more of this to date? I mean, I keep expecting interest rates to be forced up by foreign investors. Yeah. Why has that not happened? There's almost a sense that, oh, we don't need to worry. We're fine.
Yeah, Alan Greenspan calls it confounding, the fact that interest rates haven't gone up. While the private demands for money have not been terribly high, and I'm not sure I know all the reasons why, but one might be that more and more CEOs are concerned about the longer-term future. You've got the China-India competition and its effect on the economy. You've got these huge deficits. You've got aging societies all over the world. And if we think we have a problem, and this is one of the reasons we have to be very careful about depending on Europeans and Japanese. I will tell you a very brief story. I talked to the Vice Minister of Finance, recent Vice Minister, Mr. Kuroda, not long ago. And I said, Mr. Kuroda, you have a problem with aging society? They're going to lose 25% of their workers under the age of 30 in the next 10 years. And their birth rate is way, way below the replacement rate. Oh, yes, Mr. Peterson, very big problem. How are you going to finance it, Mr. Kuroda? Well, unlike you, he says, we have big savings rate, and we have big current account surplus, so we can use that for a while. But I said, Mr. Kuroda, you're financing 25% of our current account deficit. Can you spend the same money twice? And he says, very difficult problem. So the idea that we're depending on foreigners who are aging much faster, whose birth rates are much lower, whose programs are much more generous, whose payroll taxes are already very high. Do you know that in Germany and France, the payroll taxes are now between 40 and 50%? So they're going to need their money for their own purposes rather than financing our deficits.
Now, some economists feel that there's all too much scaremongering going on here and that we can simply grow our way out of this, and if productivity continues to remain high, many of these problems will just go away. I hear that
all the time. Let me talk about that. I've explained why on Social Security it's difficult to grow out of it because the benefits go up with wages and wages go up with growth. Talk about Medicare. Healthcare costs are growing much faster than inflation and much faster than the growth rate. So unless there are huge reforms here, I don't understand how we grow out of the Social Security and Medicare problem. I really don't.
So you think that's a myth?
Well, and sometime you ought to discuss Medicare reform because that makes Social Security firm look like a birthday candle.
In 2 seconds or less.
2 seconds or less.
What kind of policies should we be looking at?
We have become a society on medicine where we think we have maximum rights to every high-tech, high-cost piece of medicine there is. And we created Medicare, in which it's very open-ended, and it's cost-plus, and the costs in this country are now 2.5 times higher than other countries, with no observable increase in health outcome. So the decisions we're going to have to make to reform healthcare are going to be profound ethical issues. We're going to have to give up some medical benefit that has some medical value. We're going to have to confront the horrible word rationing, and either through increasing the market pressures or by regulation. We
So-
haven't begun to discuss those issues.
So if we think we have problems with
Oh
Social
my
Security,
goodness,
we're
I
going to be
think
much worse
Medicare
off.
is much bigger and much tougher.
And on that cheery note, let me say how fortunate we have been to have Pete Peterson, Senior Chairman and Co-founder of the Blackstone Group, as our guest today. Thank you, Pete, for joining us on the show.
My great pleasure.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Sadly, President Bush's decision to try to sell the nation on personal savings accounts as the answer to Social Security's problems has created an enormous distraction and obscured a far more serious problem. All of our entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, as well as Social Security, are consuming more than 2/3 of our government's annual budget, and that figure is just going to increase until we do something about it. As we shift to an increasingly older society, where fewer workers are paying the taxes needed to secure all of our retirement and health benefits, the financing gap just keeps growing. There is no way to avoid the math. We either have to agree as a society to trim those benefits or delay the time when our elders begin to receive them. Or, if we want to keep everything the same, we have to agree to raise taxes, by a lot. There is one other choice, and it is perhaps the most critical one of all. We can either agree to make these changes now, which will make them more gradual and easier for all of us to digest, or we can snipe at each other politically for years, ensuring that when the changes do come, and they will be imposed as a result of a financial crisis and be much more onerous. I know which choice I'd like to see us make, but given the state of political will in this country, I'm not optimistic. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.